executive directors and board members struggle with the budgeting process. And in fact, today's training was really inspired by one of my clients who I first met her before we were working together, and she came to me asking if I would review her budget, and she had been struggling to get it approved, and her board was like picking through all the details and they were very uncomfortable with it. Fast forward to the next year after we'd been working together and I'd shared some of the concepts that I'm teaching you today. She'd used them and followed a budget template that I had provided to her, which I'm going to give to all of you as well. And she brought her budget the next year. The financial plan had not changed significantly, but the format and what she was asking the board to approve did. And her board approved it with less than an hour of discussion, and they were thrilled with the new format. So today we're going to be talking specifically about when you say to your board, let's approve the budget, right? And they're passing a motion to, quote, approve the budget. What are they actually approving? For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Olivieri. I'm a nonprofit business strategist, and I love helping nonprofit leaders change the way they run their organizations. Simple tweaks, like I told you about in the story just now, that make their organizations thrive, become more financially sustainable, and make their lives as leaders a little bit easier along the way. So I've been an executive director as well as a board member. And one of the things I've always felt uncomfortable with is when you just blanket say you're approving the budget. What exactly are you approving? Are you approving every line item in there? Are you approving every expense? And what happens if at the beginning of the year when you approve the budget, there are a lot of unknowns and the budget is kind of a guess? How do you navigate that? Well, in thinking about it and working on budgets, I came to a realization is what the board really needs to be approving is their general agreement around how much the nonprofit should be concerned with bringing money in and how healthy it is financially and how comfortable they are with taking some potential financial risks or mitigating some unnecessary risks. And today I'm going to share with you some specific numbers that I encourage you to be the exact set of numbers that you have your board approve when they, quote, approve the budget, and not necessarily any other numbers besides these. So we're going to dive in. I've got slides for you today because sometimes when we talk about numbers, things get a little wordy, but I want you to have some concise vocabulary, even if it's monetary sounding, but I'm going to make sure you understand what each of these numbers mean and how they create a complete picture. So the first number that I want your board to specifically approve and agree on is a minimum program contribution margin. Well, what do I mean by contribution margin? We're going to use this term a couple times today, and it's not one that I hear talked about a lot. Your contribution margin, the easy way to remember it is how much do your programs contribute to the overall operating expenses. So contribution margin is the amount of income a program brings in, right? So through restricted grants or that you charge fees for that program, minus the expenses that are only incurred to run that program. That if you just take out those expenses, you would have your gross margin, by the way. But in addition to taking out those expenses, we're going to take out the program labor, right? The cost of paying people directly to run those programs. And after you've taken out the expenses and the labor, that leaves you with your contribution margin, the amount of program revenue, money that's left over to go into your general operating expenses. So when we approve this number, the board is saying make the maximum impact you can, but at the end of the day, all of our programs together, or maybe they'll approve it per program, needs to have at least this much money left over to cover our overall operating expenses. That's the first number. The second number is a minimum fundraising contribution margin. Again, contribution margin, right? So this is the amount of total fundraising money that comes in, unrestricted grants, individual donations, corporate sponsorships, anything that isn't restricted at all, minus the expense of doing that fundraising, right? You might have had marketing expenses and materials and supplies, things like that. And then also minus any labor that you hired to do that marketing. So the amount of money that the board is expecting at a minimum to be left over to cover other expenses. So general operating expenses and program expenses that are not covered by its own income if you have programs that cost more than they bring in, which is likely. You might, just going back one, it is possible that you will have a minimum program contribution margin that is negative. That may be the case because that's something a for-profit would never have this, but a nonprofit might, and you're going to make up the difference with your fundraising contribution margin. So that's the second thing I want your board to specifically approve. The third thing is a maximum total regular operating expense. It's a mouthful, I know, but this is the total amount of operating expenses, the maximum amount that they don't want you to exceed. So that includes probably your executive director's salary, if your executive director is mostly administrative. If your executive director is actually running programs half the time, then half their salary is a program direct expense, and half of it would be the overarching operating expenses. Your insurances, building costs that you just have regardless of what programs you're running. If you rent a space to run a program, that's different. That would be a direct program expense. So the total amount of overall operating expenses is a number that I want your board to approve. The next one is a minimum LUNA. This is such a pretty sounding number. LUNA stands for liquid, unrestricted net assets, or another way to think of it is the size of your safety net. This is all the cash you have in your bank accounts, plus things like stocks that can easily be turned into cash at a moment's notice relatively, right? So this is the size of your safety net. And it's also really important to have the board decide on what is the safety net that they're looking to have. What is the right amount of safety net given your overall expenses and how much cash flow you tend to have. The next item that I want your board to approve, and this is the last main numerical item, is the total income after all expenses. This is what we commonly refer to as the bottom line. And then divide that number by the total amount of income. So it's basically your profit. If you can have a profit as a nonprofit. So all the income minus the expenses, whatever that number is, divide it by your total income. And that's going to give you a number point something. And then you can actually times that by 100 to turn it into a percentage. So you're going to end up with a percentage. Might be 3%, might be 10%, might be 15%. Hopefully it's not negative, but technically it could be. And then I want your board to assign these three numbers. So we're creating a range. What percentage that everything below that number is considered unacceptable, unhealthy, not okay? Now, I recommend that if the number is 3% or less, that's unhealthy, just as a place to start. Because oftentimes year after year inflation changes, but oftentimes inflation is in the neighborhood of 3%. So if you're just maintaining 3%, if you're below 3%, you're not keeping up with inflation, which means even though your budget is zeroing out, you're actually on a sinking ship, right? So this is the unacceptable, we're a sinking ship number. And what I'm going to give you on the next slide is some rules that I want your board to put in place that predetermine what actions the executive director should take if they should find themselves in one of these ranges, separate from all those other numbers, because those numbers won't necessarily be the exact numbers. So first is the unacceptable range. Next is the acceptable, right? We're okay, we're treading water, it's not amazing, but at least our ship isn't sinking. And that is a range I recommend. If you don't have a place to start on your own, try setting that as a range between 3 and 5%. We're not ready to grow, but we're not having to take drastic action. And then the third number is everything over, in this case would be like everything over 5%. It means you've got enough extra money after all your expenses are paid out to be doing something more, to be growing with it. And that is going to clue your executive director to take action, a different type of action, if that becomes the case. So what is your basic plan of action if you end up in any of these ranges? Now, your board should talk about this and help create each of these 3 scenarios, but I'm going to give you a starting place here with some basic rules of thumb. So if your executive director finds that you are going into the unacceptable range, or you're in it, whether you like it or not at the beginning of the fiscal year, then the fiscal model should be revised, meaning your financial plan, which is represented in the budget, but it might also be on paper as part of your strategy or digital paper. And your focus at that point as a nonprofit should be prioritizing increasing revenue and to a certain extent decreasing expenses. But oftentimes we make the mistake of just cutting expenses, hoping that will save the day. Usually we need to be spending more in revenue generating expenses and spending less in non-revenue generating expenses in order to get out of this situation. So it's not as simple as cutting expenses. It means you want to focus spending all your money that you can scrape together on activities that are going to produce more money. And this is a really, all hands on deck if you're in the unacceptable range. If you're in the acceptable range, which may be between 3 and 5% is what I've recommended, it means that it's time to increase your safety net, right? That Luna. So the executive director can know, just proceed with the budget plan as approved. But then any additional profit that comes in, as long as they're in this range, should just be tucked away as a liquid asset, in a good generating savings account, or maybe you're investing it carefully, but it should be tucked away to increase the size of your safety net. And then if the executive director finds that you're now in a growth mode, that the profit month over month has gone above that, whatever that acceptable range is, so in this case, it might be 5%, then what you're going to do is start making a more robust plan for improvement. So this is the point at which the executive director would know they need to bring probably a new financial plan to the board saying, hey, we're doing much better than expected, and we're now going to revise our financial plan and our overall strategy so that we're still putting some money away to increase our safety net, but now we're also investing in scaling the work we do as a nonprofit. So those are the key things that I want your board to approve. And I'd like them to leave the adjusting of things during the day to the leadership team who's involved with the day-to-day so that they can make those expenses, purchases and adjust things as needed. You might also add a percentage over or under one of these at which an executive director needs to get additional approval. However, I'm quite confident that if you have these ranges in place, there are enough checks and balances to prevent anything from kind of going awry, from preventing the executive director or the leadership team from making a decision that would change the financial health and well-being of the organization without the board of directors knowing. So if you would like the template that has these numbers in it, and the very same template that I told you about in the beginning of this training, I have that available for you at pivotground.com/budget-template. And here it is. And you can also schedule a one-on-one consultation call with me at pivotground.com/apply. If you're watching this on YouTube, please take a moment to like and subscribe. And for those of you who are live with me now, hang tight and we're going to do Q&A. If you would like to be here live for the Q&A on the next call, please go ahead to pivotground.com and sign up to receive our live micro training notices.